Hi, everyone. Today we're with Professor Hicks, and we're going to talk about his book, What's Wrong with Europe and How to Fix It. My first question is for those who haven't read the books yet. So it's, what do you think are the three main ideas or the three core concepts of the book, Professor Hicks?
Well, first of all, I mean, the book was written in 2007, 2008, so it's a little out of date. But looking at it again, which I've done recently, of course, given the crises, it's, I was remarkably lucky in a way, in that a lot of what I said or wrote about in the book is still relevant today. Sadly, one might say, right? So I was trying to make the point that, the European, on the one hand, the European Union is a unique experiment, but it solves a lot of important problems for member states and for citizens in Europe. But it has three sorts of interrelated challenges. One is low levels of popular legitimacy. And of course, we've seen that with the Brexit referendum in the UK and with the rejection of the constitutional treaty in France and the Netherlands. The second thing is policy gridlock, which is, lots and lots of checks and balances in the way the EU works, which make it very difficult for the EU to reach decisions, particularly when you've got heterogeneous preferences. And, you can see that today in how the EU responded to the COVID pandemic. You can see that in the battle just recently about the EU response to what's happened in Belarus and in Minsk, so it's going to be very difficult to sustain consensus with all the checks and balances in the EU. And the third problem is the democratic deficit. And we're still talking about the democratic deficit. And there's still a sense that the EU is not accountable. So identified, popular legitimacy or lack of popular legitimacy, gridlock, and the democratic deficit. And those three challenges are still here today. And what I argued is that the EU should gradually move towards a model of what I called a limited democratic politics, i.e. a little bit more majoritarianism, a little bit more transparency, a little bit more accountability, but within the constraints of the EU institutions. So not like a full-blown winner-takes-all like the UK. I think of it as a kind of continuum. At one end of a continuum of democratic politics is very majoritarian politics like the UK, where the majority can really dictate and do whatever they want. And at the other end is this heavily, heavily constrained polity with lots and lots of checks and balances, where it's pretty impossible for anybody to do anything they want. And all I'm suggesting was the EU should just move a little bit more down that spectrum, a little bit more towards more standard democratic politics. The EU tried to do that in some senses. The biggest failure, from my point of view, is the failure of the Spitzenkandidat model, which is something that I advocated in the book, and was pleasantly surprised that actually the EU moved in that direction. I mean, I can't claim credit for this, but I was one of the voices, one of several voices that were arguing for this sort of thing back in 2007, 2008, and then it was introduced. And if you look at it, you can say it failed because the heads of government rejected the winner of the last Spitzenkandidat model and went for a compromise candidate, went for Ursula von der Leyen. But on the other hand, I'm not sure it's dead yet. And I think it's going to be interesting to see what happens in the 2024 European election. So anyway, that's a kind of little summary of what I thought I was trying to argue in the book and my perspective now looking back.
Well, you totally anticipated my second question, which was about the Spitzenkandidat. And so I was just wondering one of our members was wondering if you could talk about other possible mechanisms, other procedural tools we could, or a future European executive could use to make Europe more representative.
Yeah, so I mean, I had a set of proposals that covered the European Parliament, the Council, and the Commission. So for the European Parliament is a very consensus-oriented institution, which is good, but it doesn't need to be because there are so many checks and balances in the system. So I actually thought what we should be trying to do is raise the stakes in European Parliament elections slightly, because what happens in European Parliament elections is voters really vote on domestic politics. And in a sense, it's rational for them to do that. It's not irrational, because they say, it actually doesn't really matter who wins in the European Parliament, because the outcome is going to move slightly to the left, slightly to the right. And with all the checks and balances in the EU, that's not going to matter. So what will matter is what this election means for domestic politics. Now, if you could change that dynamic by raising the stakes in European Parliament elections, by saying, okay, let's make it a little winner takes more, i.e., let's give the biggest groups in the European Parliament more committee chairs, more agenda setting power, more ability to shape what goes on, then the majority in the European Parliament will matter. And if the majority in the European Parliament matters, national parties, national politicians, voters will start to take European Parliament elections more seriously. It will make a difference, right? So, and I think that's relatively low risk. I don't think that it's about politicizing the EU a bit more with a capital P. And so that was the European Parliament. For the Council, I think we really should be opening up the Council much more when it's making legislative politics. So they've made it a little bit more transparent, but it's not yet fully transparent. We should know it should operate much more like a standard legislature where there's clear open agendas. We know who's proposing amendments. We know who's co-sponsoring amendments. We know who's speaking on different things. We should turn it into a standard legislative chamber when it's doing legislative politics. The Council still operates like a diplomatic body, where it's foreign ministers meeting behind closed doors in not smoke-filled rooms, but they might as well be. So, bargaining over different things. It would be much better if we just properly opened it up. So that's the Council and the Parliament. For the Commission, I do think the Spitzenkandidat model is the right way to go. I think a lot more could be done. The main fault of it not working lies in the EPP, lies in the largest political group who really did not take it seriously, and the leaders in the group do not take it seriously. And they're not going to take it seriously until they think they're going to lose. So while they think they're always going to win, I think they won't necessarily take it seriously. So I think there is a possibility, and I think it would have been interesting at the last elections. I actually think Macron miscalculated, because Macron thought, I don't like the Spitzenkandidat model because I'm not going to win it. Whereas actually, in hindsight, he might actually have won it. Had he gone and said, Vestager is my candidate. Vestager is the candidate of the Liberals, whatever you want to call them, Aldi or the new name, Renew Europe, whatever you want to call them. Had Vestager been the candidate, she could well have ended up being a compromise candidate that could have won the election. So I think he miscalculated. I think it will change when we see the EPP losing, because if the EPP think they're going to lose, then suddenly they'll start to take it seriously, and they're going to then have to nominate a more credible person. I thought Alex Stubb was a very interesting candidate. I mean, I have to declare an interest. I know Alex personally, but I thought he was a very interesting candidate, and I think he gave it some sort of interesting perspective. I'd love to see a more open primary inside the EPP, an open primary inside the PDS, that kind of thing. That would really invigorate the process. I think a lot of young voters across Europe are really starting to engage with it. So I don't think it's dead yet. I just think it could be tweaked in a way. The process should start earlier. We should have more open debate, open primaries, and gradually open it up. Put pressure on national party leaders, particularly in the EPP, to take it more seriously.
Yeah, it was so shocking that Manfred Weber didn't even show up for the debate. I remember that he didn't show up for the debate.
Yeah, that's right. So right. And then, in some ways, the debates worked better the time before, but it was very Western Europe centric. So there's interesting research from 2014 Spitzenkandidat process, which was the first time we had it, where the member states where they had the debates had much higher recognition and understanding of the process. And the voters in those member states, if they had watched a TV debate, they were far more likely to show up in the election and vote. And then you had very, very low turnout in Central and Eastern Europe, in many parts in Central and Eastern Europe. There was no effort to engage. There were no candidates from Central and Eastern Europe. There was no real TV coverage or media coverage. And of course, they didn't engage with it. And now I'm going to say something which I think a lot of pro-Europeans will find controversial. I was really hoping there was going to be a really openly Eurosceptic candidate, a kind of Nigel Farage type figure. Then the debates would be fun. People would watch the debate. People underestimate the kind of personal, the soap opera nation, element of politics, right? That, we tune into politics because it's fun, and we watch it, and we take sides, and we say, I like that woman, and I don't like that guy. And, we take sides in this, right? And people who say, well, people won't identify with candidates because if they're not from their member state, I don't buy that. I mean, you know, we took sides in US presidential elections, right? We took sides in primaries in the Democratic Party or the Republican Party. If we Europeans can take sides in American politics, why can we not take sides in our own politics, in European level politics, right? We can, of course, and look at us as Europeans. How many football teams do you support in different countries in Europe, right? So, I mean, your generation, my son's generation, he'll tell you, I like Atletico and I like Juve and I like PSG. And, come on. I mean, this is young people today. We've grown up in this environment where we're used to thinking creatively about different things. We're not constrained by a kind of national culture and national environment. So I'm optimistic that we'll develop a political culture in Europe where we will be able to identify with different candidates from different places in a European level election. I don't think that's unthinkable, and I think that's what we should be really striving for.
I really appreciated the fact that none of your proposals were needed treaty change. So they're all things that are doable. I mean,
yeah. I mean, treaty change is a bit. I mean, I don't like to be mean to my lawyer friends, but I kind of are frustrated with the sort of Euro lawyer perspective on a lot of EU politics, which is, if we change the laws, the politics will follow. And I actually think it's the other way around. I actually think, when you think about a constitution is just a framework. It's what you fill that with. It's the politics you fill that with that is really what democracy is all about, right? So the treaties themselves are remarkably flexible in terms of what we can do within the framework of the treaties now. There's a lot there. It's actually more majoritarian than you think. There's you can completely change the way the European Parliament works. You could really change the way the European elections work. You could change the way the Spitzenkandidat process. There's enough there in the treaties. You could really open up the council. You don't need treaty change to make that stuff work.
My second question is actually a serious question from a very serious question from a lawyer, a European lawyer friend of mine, who is asking if you could talk a bit more about the EU Commission presidential campaign, or how that process works, because I'm sure you know more than us.
Well, so I mean, it starts with the idea that the political parties in Europe can choose rival candidates for the Commission president, right? So formally speaking, in the treaties changed and evolved from originally the choice of the Commission president being the sole choice of the heads of government by unanimity, to then being the choice of the heads of government and then a vote in the European Parliament, to then being a choice by majority vote of the heads of government, and saying they must take account of European Parliament elections. So there's enough there now within that framework for us to say that you can actually connect that process to European Parliament elections. There's nothing in the treaty to say you can't do that, and there's nothing in the treaty to say you must do that. So there's plenty of flexibility there. So you've got the way I think of it is, I think about the European Council as a sort of collective head of state. It's like a collective presidency. And if you think about what happens in most parliamentary democracies, is you have an election, national parties choose their candidate to be the prime minister or to be the chancellor in Germany. And then there's a battle after the elections about who can form a majority in the parliament. If one party wins a majority, it's their candidate. And their candidate is then invited by the president to become the prime minister. Or in Britain, they're invited by the Queen. If you've been watching The Crown, you're invited by the Queen to become the prime minister, right? So in a sense, that's the framework we now have for the EU. European Parliament elections, and then the European Council invites the person who won the election to form the Commission, to become the Commission president. So the question is what is the winner of the election? That's, I think, an interesting question. Because is the winner of the election the candidate of the largest political group in the European Parliament? Or is the winner of the election the person who commands a majority in the European Parliament? Now, they could be two different people. And in democratic politics at the national level, it's the latter, which is more important. Most national democracies work on the following idea, that you have a sort of either of a formateur. The party that has the largest number of seats has first go at trying to build a majority. And if they fail, it shifts to the second largest group, and they then have a go. So, but those are not normally written into constitutions. Those are sort of normative practices that evolve. So I think it would be great to develop those kind of frameworks within the rules of the European Parliament that say things like, the candidate of the largest group has first go at trying to win a majority in the Parliament, and if they fail, the candidate of the second largest group has a go, and so on, right? So I think you can develop those. I would like to see those sorts of procedures evolve, and then I think we'll move towards a more democratic model for choosing the Commission president.
A phrase that really struck me in your book was, let me see if I can find it. You talked about a backbencher, an MP, who said he felt like all his proposals were paper planes that he was throwing against a government bulldozer or tractor. And I was just wondering if you think that the same thing's going to happen in the European Parliament. I mean, after a while, after this...
Not really. Yeah,
yeah,
I mean, that's a really good point. So, I mean, I think that the EU will not evolve to a fully parliamentary model, right? I mean, we're already seeing the emergence of government opposition dynamics in the European Parliament. But the Commission itself is not going to be made up of one political party or even two political parties, because each of the governments are choosing commissioners, right? So inevitably, the Commission is a grand coalition of 3 or 4 parties. And so inevitably, you're going to have a grand coalition in the European Parliament that supports the Commission. And in that sense, and equally, the other reason why you won't have that sort of standard relationship between a national government and the national parliament is the Commission cannot dissolve the European Parliament, right? So you have a separation of powers. So in a sense, it is a bit of a hybrid model. So, the reason why Austin Mitchell feels like his life in the House of Commons is throwing paper aeroplanes at a bulldozer is because the government in the House of Commons has ultimate power. They have a majority of seats, and they can threaten, if they don't back me, you sack me, and then we have an election. And so, it's that power, that vote of no confidence power, that forces the backbenchers to support the government of the day. And so you then have these very cohesive blocks. The European Parliament, the Commission does not have that power over the European Parliament, and the European Parliament does not have that power over the Commission. Yes, they can censure the Commission, but it requires a higher threshold. It requires a 2/3 majority vote, which is so in practice, the censorship of the Commission is a bit like impeachment of a US president. It's very difficult to do. You can only do it for high crimes and misdemeanors. You can't do it for kind of just political reasons, right? So I think there will always be that separation of powers between the Commission and the Parliament. And so that will allow the Parliament to carry on being a very independent, powerful institutions, much more similar to House of Representatives in the US than to many national parliaments in Europe.
In your book, you talk about procedural and substantive democracy. But I was wondering if you could give us some concrete proposals that you'd like to see in the European Parliament rules. So things you think would really change the way things are going.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good point. I mean, so procedural democracy is where, you write down all the rules, say you have a free press, you have free and fair elections, you have multiple political parties, you've got checks and balances and so on. But I think as a political scientist, we say, what is the content? What's the substantive content? Is there competition for power? Does the party that wins have a reasonable chance of losing at the next election? So, I mean, the classic example we like to use is Singapore, where we say, procedurally, Singapore is a democracy, but in practice, it's not, because the party in power is never going to lose, right? So there's a kind of, that's the difference between procedural and substantive, right? So I think in many ways the EU is procedurally a democracy, but substantively is not. You don't get that feeling. You don't really get a feeling that there's winners and losers. There was a campaign, and we as the voters, we participated in this, and it was a fair and open and transparent contest, and we acknowledge these guys won and I lost. And then the losers say, you get losers' consent, which is a very important notion in democracy, losers' consent. And losers' consent is, you guys won this time round, but we're going to get you next time, right? So so the idea is, if you permanently lose, you don't have losers' consent. You get loser to consent if it's temporary. If there's a reasonable chance you win next time, right? So in that sense, that's the overall picture. When it comes to the European Parliament itself, I actually think you could change some procedures to encourage that more majoritarian governance inside the European Parliament. I think you could have a majority in the Parliament that has no. So currently, the committee chairs in the Parliament and all of the key offices in the Parliament are allocated purely proportionally. So that gives the big parties a little bit more power. But why not say the first 5 committee chairs go to the largest group, and then you allocate the rest proportionally? That really gives the biggest party a lot of power. And that really would change the dynamic of the elections, because it will mean there's a lot more at stake. If you raise the stakes in elections, that's when you will get parties forming and parties competing, right? So that's exactly what happened in national elections. When the reason why elections mattered is because the governing parties felt like they might lose. And so they then established mass political party organizations to compete in those elections. And so if you raise the stakes inside the European Parliament, that's when I think you have incentives for those European level parties to really start to fight those elections and take on. What we need is European level parties to take on the power that national parties have to control those elections.
Well, this is a rather strange question. It's because one of our members is asking, how could Italy play a more dominant role in European politics?
Well, it's interesting that Italy, in some senses, you can argue that recently Italy has not played as significant as a role as it probably should or could have done, given its size, right? It's the 3rd largest member state in the EU. 3rd largest economy in the EU. It's not that much behind France in terms of population and economy and so on. But historically, it tends to be a Franco-German domination. But it's interesting how the French, about a decade ago or more, they were worried about them being marginalized in European politics, particularly in the European Parliament, because they had lots of different political parties and they were spread between lots of different political groups in the European Parliament. So it's interesting that I think fragmentation of politics within Italy has limited the influence of Italian politicians in the European Parliament. So I think there was a period where Italy was very influential when it had big representation in the EPP and when it had big representation in the Socialist group. And when there was a period then where Italy was really, really influential. And of course, Italy had the Commission president. So I think it goes through waves. And I think Italy will get back to being very influential in EU politics. And it's going to be interesting to see now, with the UK, of course, leaving the EU, that in a sense, rather than it being a big 4 or big 5, if you count Spain, we're now down to a big 3 or 4, right? So perhaps Poland we should add in there. But in a sense, Italy is at the top table. And I think having governments that are either technocratic governments or governments that are with prime ministers that are not from the major political groups, I also think that marginalizes a country. And so, see the power of Viktor Orban because he was in the EPP. I mean, they should have kicked him out, but the fact that he wanted to stay in the EPP was because he knew that gives him power. He gets to go to those EPP leader summits, which gives him influence ahead of the European Council meetings, which allows him to shape it. Don't underestimate the role political parties in Europe play in shaping the overall agenda for Europe behind the scenes. The EPP in particular, but also S&D and Renew, right? So if you're not around the table with those other big political leaders, you're then marginalized in politics. So I think having a technocratic government or having a prime minister not from one of the major parties in Europe, I think inevitably means you're marginalized. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens after the next Italian election. We've got a lot going on in Italy. The next election could lead to a radical right government. I think that Italy would then be influential, but in a very different way than what we've been talking about.
I think it's our last question. I think I lost it. Just give me 3 seconds. Oh yeah, here it is. What do you think is going to happen with the Conference of Europe?
I'm not optimistic, I'm afraid. I mean, one thing I do like is the effort to engage citizens, and the sort of participatory democracy elements of it, citizens' assemblies. the whole listening and debating process, the deliberative process, I mean, that is really, I think, very positive and very encouraging. And I think that's something that should, in a sense, be a permanent feature of European politics, to think about this. And it's I know from the work of, for example, David Farrell in Ireland and the great things they've been doing in Ireland with the Citizens' Assembly and a lot of the things he's now developed around the world and following that sort of model. Citizens' Assemblies are really fantastic ways for overcoming political polarization, for getting people to understand each other's political views, for voters to learn about the political process and understand political issues are not black and white. Everything is grey. Everything is much more difficult and nuanced than you might think. And citizens' assemblies are very good ways for helping people understand that and express their own views, form their own views as part of that process. So that side of it, I think I'm very enthusiastic about and I find very positive. What I'm less positive about is I'm skeptical it will lead to anything really significant. And even if it does lead to anything really significant, I'm skeptical they'll get it ratified. The hurdles are just too high. Unanimity amongst the member states, ratification in all these national parliaments, various different, referendums at some point. And when you think about the heterogeneity of preferences of the citizens across Europe, the governments across Europe, the nations across Europe, the parliaments across Europe, think how many veto players there are in that process. I really don't expect this to lead to very much, I'm afraid.
I actually have one last question, because we're all reading Robert Caro's books on Lyndon Johnson, and in his books he uses the right to vote for Black Americans as a door-opening law that makes racial segregation almost impossible. I was wondering if you think there is a sort of a door-opening law that might make Europe much more united or much more stronger.
Madam, that is a brilliant, brilliant thought, right? So I've often thought that the real challenge for democracy is across the world is to move to electronic democracy, right? Why do we not have an app on our phones? Why do you not have an app where you can vote? And I actually think if the EU said in the 2024 European Parliament elections, we're going to have a phone app, we're going to have where people can vote in the European Parliament elections on their phone, that would be totally transformative, right? Because then I think you suddenly that would mean European Parliament elections are different to national elections. There's something fundamentally different. You can learn about the candidates on your phone, you can learn about the positions on your phone, and you can vote on your phone. Can you imagine if we did that? It would be like Eurovision but politics, right? So this is what we need for the EU. And if we're going to transform European democracy, I think something like that would be the way to do it. So, and I love the connection to Lyndon Johnson and the civil rights voting stuff, because I think it's a little bit analogous to that.
Thank you so much for your time. And when you come to Florence, please do let us know.
Absolutely. And you're Korean by background, are you?
Yes, yes, I'm Korean.
감사합니다.
감사합니다. Thank you so much. Take care.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Bye.